So I was born down in central Victoria, just in Bendigo. The eldest of four kids, two boys, two girls. My mum was a high school teacher. My father was a psychiatric nurse. They're obviously now both retired. And I had a very standard, growing up in a country town, high school, cricket, rugby. Went to university when I finished high school in Bendigo, and then joined the Navy. Not long after I finished university, I worked for a short period of time, and then decided to join the Navy. But I didn't really come from a military family in the sense that I had serving members that I grew up around. But I suppose I sort of just had a natural interest in that side of it as well. So I did a standard sort of high school, math, science, did my HSC, dabbled a bit and ended up doing a business degree of all things, and worked for a very short period of time as an economist for about 6 months. And at the same time I finished university, I applied to come in as a direct entry officer. So I was selected and went through HMAS Creswell, which is the Naval College down at Jervis Bay. So I went there as a 23-year-old. Interestingly enough, not the oldest by a long way. I think our median age on the intake was about 26. So 6 months at the Naval College, and then I joined my first ship actually, which was one that was being refitted up in Newcastle for just in a bit of a holding pattern. And then I started my training. Actually, as well as in that holding pattern, I got posted to Tobruk, HMAS Tobruk in 99. No, that wasn't. Sorry, it was 97, the year that I joined. Sorry. And we ended up doing the first offload up in Bougainville at the end of 97. So as a very junior midshipman, still waiting to actually go off and do my training, I sort of got caught up on my first operational trip somewhere. And so even at that sort of stage, the bug bites pretty hard. So we just, and I didn't spend a lot of time up there. We drove up, we dropped off the army when they did their first lodgement in Bougainville. And then we came back, did my standard training as what we would call an officer of the watch. So all my bridge watchkeeping training, and posted to my first ship, which was HMAS Anzac, actually in a billet, where I trained as an officer of the watch. And we, in those days used to do a lot of time up in Southeast Asia. And then as a trainee officer of the watch in Anzac, deployed to East Timor in support of what was then Warden, and the prelude into that East Timor in 99. Look, it was really energising, I must admit. When you're that young and stupid, you don't really think about much else other than, wow, how cool is this? It wasn't until later deployments where you start worrying about other sorts of things. But and that time I can just remember it being, because no one had done anything like that for a very long time in the Navy context. The old and bolds were the guys who deployed to the Middle East in the early 90s for Optimask, and you'd occasionally see guys wandering around with a medal or two for that, but there wasn't much of anything else. So we went up and we were there to support the lodgement of troops into East Timor, and I think we sort of did 20 odd days on station. It was enough to get an active service medal, but not enough for everything else. And we had a job to do, which we did, and then we peeled off. So that was my time in Anzac. That was great. After that I went to frigates as an officer of the watch, and then got selected to be a navigating officer. And so that meant a trip up to Darwin and Cairns and Darwin, working in patrol boats. And that was obviously in the early 2000s when we were dealing a lot with, the illegal immigration and those sorts of things. And that was a really trying time for a lot of people. And the work that people were doing up there obviously involved some real human tragedy. I mean, we were dealing with people who had, at that stage, initially fled out of the Kosovo conflict and been through some pretty horrible things. And then obviously a lot of people that started coming out of the Middle East as well. And you've got pretty young sailors who join the Navy to drive ships and do whatever, who are suddenly pulling dead babies and stuff out of the water. And that had a real impact on those guys. And it was a very challenging, it was very rewarding, but it was some tough work. And as I said, I think that a lot of people don't realise what we did to some of our people up there, putting them through that. So I got posted to Darwin and then ultimately deployed with her in 2002 to what was then Op Slipper. which was the sanctions against Iraq, the follow-on of all the Damascus stuff. So Darwin and Anzac deployed in late 2002. So there was a big chemical weapons threat, obviously, in that theatre, and that was actually how we knew that the shooting war was about to start. So we got a signal in the day before where they said, look, everyone's got to be clean shaven by 1800 today, and I'd had a beard for a very long time, and break out all your chemical suits, your MBCD equipment, and actually pull them out of the vacuum sealed bags and make sure that they're all ready to go. Now, anyone who's been in the military for any time will know that they will not normally open up things that only have a shelf life and just leave them sitting around for too long. They don't like to spend that many pennies. So to me, that was, well, if they're ready to burn a whole ship full of this kit, they're obviously getting pretty serious about it. So we sort of thought there was something happening. And then I seem to remember, it was probably about 4 o'clock the next morning, the officer of the watch came and woke me up. So the navigating officer sleeps at the back of the bridge because you're on call all the time. So the officer of the watch walked in and went, oh, you've got Tomahawks flying over the top of us and it looks like it might be on. So basically what happened was that the Australian ships, so ourselves and Anzac, were right up at the mouth of a river called the Khwar el Abdallah, so the KAA. And our role up until that point had been enforcing the sanctions against Iraq. So what was basically happening was there were a bunch of dhows that would come out most nights and they were smuggling dates and smuggling oil to get hard currency for the Iraqi regime. So we would position ourselves basically right up at the mouth of that river. And as we saw them start to come out, we'd put our boarding parties in and they'd board these vessels overnight. And you'd see them coming out sort of a little bit after dusk. The boarding parties would go out and they might do 5, 10, 15, 20 boardings in a night. And they'd be out for most of the night and turn them all around and send them back. As things sort of progressed, we got an instruction to clear everything that was coming out of the KAA. So that runs up to Qasr, which is their main port. So they'd started a big information op campaign to say, we're going to come up there and we're going to go downtown on you. This is the Americans with all their shock and awe. So we shifted from turning them around to clearing them. So we were putting boarding parties on, and we had a 48-hour period where they said everything that comes through, go through it, make sure there's no senior leadership, make sure there's no WMD or any of that stuff. And there were special markings that we used to have to paint on the side of the ship, and then they could keep going. Because by that stage there was a massive naval presence up in that part, but we were right up at the front end of it. So that was those last couple of days, and then obviously that night they started with the Tomahawks. Anzac started her naval gunfire support into the Alfour Peninsula to support the Royal Marine landings. They took out the oil platforms that were astern of us. And it all just started happening from there. We were basically the air picket for Anzac, sitting on her, waiting for, in case they sent any aircraft out. We had, reports that the patrol boats were coming out, so we got ourselves ready to go and, engage in naval surface warfare. And then we thought at the time, unfortunately, the US Air Force sent one of their C-130s up there and took care of it for us. So, we had that. We had some mines. We were involved in the intercept of there was a tug that the Iraqis had converted with a barge so that they could send it down and basically surreptitiously lay mines all down that KAA, because obviously it was going to be a pretty important piece of water. And Canimbla, I think, were the ones that intercepted it, but we had the dive team on board, so our divers went up and did the investigation on all the stuff there and basically rendered stuff safe, and we were pretty involved in that. And then, and it was probably 4 or 5 days of really intense activity. I seem to remember not leaving the bridge much at all for those days. I mean, we were wearing body armour on the bridge in all our exposed places. And the FFG's Darwin, she's an older style of ship, so there's gaps and bits of air and all the rest of it. But I can remember that one of the things that So if the gas alarm went off, we were supposed to make sure that, you know, we were all dogged down. And obviously the bridge is enclosed, but the bridge roof is where all your bosuns and your lookouts and everything are. And it was basically, you make sure that you're not holding the door open for them. The doors are shut, and they're not coming in. And I was sort of sitting there going, well, you know, because I was probably going to be on the bridge, you know, and I had images in my head of, you know, holding the door down as sailors were madly banging on it or something, trying to come in and those sorts of things. So that was probably one of the major things that worried me about the whole process. You could go down to the ops room and see the radar tracks of the Scud missiles winging into Kuwait, and then you could go down to and watch them hitting on the TV in the wardroom and those sorts of things. So it wasn't an esoteric threat. It felt very immediate, and I suppose sort of one of the more. It's difficult because obviously by the time we got to the end of it, you know, everyone got through. It was all great. There were never, you know, and we all came back, and so a lot of people sort of sit there and go, oh well, you know, it was all a bit of a cakewalk, and you really don't know how it's going to play out on the day. But I can remember sitting there thinking, there's someone out there who doesn't know me from a bar of soap and never will, but if they had the chance, you know, would want to do me some pretty serious harm. And that's a pretty confronting thought process to work through. Now, and it's also a really removed one, because when you're on a ship, you're not charging up a hill, you're not sitting in a hole, there's not things raining down around you. It's a bit more of it's a background tension rather than an immediate, you know, or at least it was for us. And so we were, yeah, and I still think that, you know, it was an element of luck. It was an element of being pretty good at what we were doing. It was an element of maybe they didn't know what they were doing quite well enough. You know, assign the percentages however you want, but you don't really know that at the time. So you sort of work through those processes. It's very easy to sit in a very middle class, safe Australian environment and talk about what people on the other side of the world should or shouldn't be doing. It's very hard to put yourself in that person's shoes. And it's very hard to actually understand what that is until you're confronted with it. And I think that's what a lot of our guys do, and it takes them a while to process it, but it makes you a bit more circumspect about some of that commentary that you'll see around Australia. You know, it doesn't make me smarter or anything like that, but you sit there and go, look, you know, if I had absolutely nothing and I had my wife and my 3 children who I love very much today, you know, explain to me why you wouldn't sell everything that you had and give yourself the best shot that you possibly could to do everything that you can for them. Because, you know, we live in a society where people will give you 15 reasons why they should be allowed to speed and shouldn't have to pay a parking ticket, who'll then turn around and go, well, you're a queue jumper if you're trying to get out of a country where your kids can't get fresh water. So, yeah, I think it changes your view on a few of those sorts of things. I think if I've picked up one thing after 21 years in the Navy is that the systems and the way we train people and the things that we push people to do actually works. And if you make them do it. The thing that I think my sailors have already discovered is we don't do things because it's there to tick a box. We don't do things because it's there to get through this assessment or whatever. We do these things because as soon as the ship leaves the wharf, there is only one group of people that is responsible for what's happening on board and 100% committed to what happens on board. You can have all the support mechanisms you want in the world and the systems around the ship and the shore and you know, supply and all that. But when the ship leaves the wharf, there's 185 people that are the ones that swim home if it doesn't work. And so you have to take that personal responsibility to make sure that you can do your bit, you can drag your mate out of his bit and get them to where they need to be. And that's, in varying ways, I reinforce that one particular message every time. You know, whether that be down at the fire grounds doing firefighting training, we're not just going through this door to show that we can turn a hose on, we're going through this door because one day, you know, there's going to be 3 of your mates lying on the deck on the other side of it and a whole room full of smoke. And that's why we do it, not because we need to tick the box. So I was deployed when my first child was born. I was in the Middle East. And we were off the coast of Pakistan actually doing those operations. I couldn't get back. My wife was 8.5 months pregnant the day we sailed. But my captain was mad keen because he'd had children and I really was so work orientated. I didn't quite understand what a big deal it was. But so my son was born and he said, right, we'll fly you across, we'll get you home. Unfortunately, at the same time, there was one of the soldiers in the task group was killed in an IED strike, and so I had I flew back to the UAE to join a flight to meet my son, and we had to wait to get that flight while we did the ramp ceremony for this young lad. And after I posted off Stuart, I went down to the Staff College and I was studying down there, and I would go to the War Memorial quite a bit, and I'd look at this kid's name because he was 21, and I never knew him. I'll never know him. But for me, learning to be a parent and heading off to this incredible experience that is a life-defining experience, this kid's parents were going through exactly the same thing, but it was a life-defining experience at the other end of the spectrum. And so I always make my kids put a poppy on that young lad's name. They put that there and they put it on a couple of other family members. But it's a lot more immediate. It's not about going out on Anzac Day and drinking 4 million cans and acting like a dickhead. It's about sitting there and actually taking stock of the things that you can now do that other people never will. And as much as I heard people say those words when I was a young kid, you've got to have something get under your skin to make you actually understand what that means. I don't know if that makes me appreciate things better or worse. I don't necessarily think it does. I don't think there are some things I don't tolerate now that I would have, and there are other things I sit there and go, really, who cares? But I think that's the one thing that really struck with me out of that. And so to then be the CR of a ship and have that trust put in you by all those parents and wives and husbands and all the rest of it. And I think that the thing that, you worry about the day where you turn left, you turn right, it doesn't really matter, and how you'll cope on that day. When I went out and fought the fires in West Australia as a junior officer, and one of my lasting impressions on that was the impact it had on the CEO of that ship, and the way he spoke about his crew and those sorts of things. And I think that the difficulty in being in the military is you think that you're immortal, so you're not worried about what happens to you. You're more worried about what happens to the person that you're responsible for. What the regret around, had I done something, and that's the thing that worries you more, because let's face it, if anything serious happens to me, I deal with that. But if anything serious happens to someone else, I've imposed that on a whole range of people, that person, their family, all sorts of things.